Guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Favor Godwill, and on this channel we talk about everything forensic. If you're a new subscriber, thank you very much for stopping by, and if you are a returning subscriber, thank you very much for coming back again. Please, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, take a minute to subscribe and take a minute to share this video with somebody that you love. Today we are going to be talking about a very interesting murder case in history. Now, this case is very peculiar because there was literally no visible clue for the police to work with. There was no evidence. But then, remember when we talked about trace evidence? So we are going to see how trace evidence was very key in solving this murder. On the 8th of February 1968, Bernard Josephs discovered his wife Claire's lifeless body beneath their bed when he returned to his house in Bromley, England. There were defensive wounds on her hands, which appeared to be caused by a serrated knife. The cut on her throat was so deep that it extended to her spine. There was no weapon found at the Josephs' house, and the police had no other clues to go on. Since there was no clue, the next important step was to determine the time and circumstances of her death. An assessment of the crime scene showed that there was no forced entry into the house. Ingredients of a meal Claire had been preparing were still in a bowl in the kitchen, and a half-empty cup of coffee was left on the table, which helped to determine the time and circumstances of the crime, and also established that a friend or acquaintance had dropped by while Claire was making dinner. So, investigations were focused on family and friends. Among the numerous people the police questioned was Roger Payne, a recent acquaintance of Bernard and Claire. Roger had earlier convictions for attacks on women, and the saw scratches on his hands. Despite Roger's attempts to downplay the marks, forensic examination of his clothes revealed some extremely damaging evidence. Even though his clothing had been laundered, the seams and hems still contained over 60 sterile wool fibers, matching the wool dress Claire was wearing when she was murdered. Investigators then examined Claire's car and found traces of blood matching Roger's blood type, as well as additional clothing fibers. Through the help of this evidence, a fast prosecution and conviction of Roger was secured 3 months after the murder in May 1968. Now, I'm sure when you listen to this story, your mind went back to when we talked about how to identify individuals, and then we mentioned blood grouping as a way to identify individuals and a primary identifier. By the way, your mind would have also gone back to when we talked about the different types of evidence. I mentioned trace evidence and other trace evidence. We had different types. We had fibers, we had glass, and so many other types of evidence. So now we are going to analyze the case and look at the usefulness of fibers to it. Fibers have distinctive characteristics such as color, composition, and texture, which can be transferred during contact between individuals or between a person and their environment. And then the fibers that are being transferred depends on the texture of the recipient's garment, the length and pressure of contact. Take for instance, I give you a long hug for 30 minutes, or I just give you a quick hug, just less than 5 minutes or less than a minute hug. So the tendency for you to have my clothing fibers on your clothes is higher than when it's just a quick hug. It also depends. Take for instance, I'm putting on a woolen clothing and you are putting on a leather jacket. The tendency for you to have my clothing fibers on your leather jacket is lower than if you were putting on some other material, maybe polyester, maybe, or even a woolen clothing as well. Two things to consider here. Roger previously had convictions for attacks on women, and then when it was now established that family, friends or acquaintances were behind the crime, they began investigation. And when it got to Roger's turn, they found scratches on his hands. Very interesting. So that's why the efforts that Roger, probably he gave an excuse like, oh, he was doing something, probably trying to garden, and then he scratched himself, or his hands were itchy and then he scratched himself. But then let's look at the thoughts behind the crime. Let's look at trying to reconstruct the crime scene here. Since Roger had previously had attacks on women, one thing to consider, which we have already looked at, probably there would have been a tussle, because Claire also had scratches, Claire also had injuries on her body, and she was also cut down to her spine, a very deep wound. So there would have been a tussle, there would have been a struggle between both of them. So that would have probably led to Roger being injured, also giving him the scratches on his hands. So this is what prompted the police or the investigators to also request his clothing, to seize his clothing for forensic examination. And then when they seized his clothing, when his clothing was seized, they found over 60 sterilized wool fibers on it. And these 60 sterilized wool fibers were the same, they were matched to the particular clothing that Claire wore when she died at the time of her death. The specificity and the volume cannot be overlooked. It cannot be downplayed, because it is not a coincidence, definitely. Further investigators then went to check Claire's car and they found blood, and the blood matched Roger's blood group. So how did it get there? There were also additional fibers that were found, but now at this point, how can Roger explain that he was not at the crime scene? So these are things that linked Roger to the crime scene. It's a very strong link, it was a very strong link, and this was what helped to serve justice. Next week, we're going to look at how to recover fibers, and this technique is called fiber lifting. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, don't forget to share, and don't forget to subscribe. Share this video with somebody that you love and leave a comment in the comment section. Bye and see you next time.